The Magnolia Restaurant stood as a beacon of fine dining in the small town of Oak Ridge. Its polished oak floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and white tablecloths adorned tables arranged with mathematical precision. The restaurant had earned its reputation as the go-to establishment for the town's elite politicians, business owners, and celebrities passing through would make reservations weeks in advance. 28-year-old James Whitaker adjusted his bow tie in the employee bathroom mirror. 6 months into his job as head waiter, and he still felt the same flutter of nervous excitement before each shift. The Magnolia wasn't just a job, it was his stepping stone. Every generous tip brought him closer to saving enough to attend culinary school in New York. Every connection with the town's influential diners could be the one that changed his trajectory. The table assignments are posted. Everyone called Diane, the floor manager, her voice cutting through the pre-shift chatter. James scanned the list. His section included tables 7, 9, 12, and 15 prime locations by the windows overlooking the garden. Perfect. The wealthier patrons preferred those tables, and wealthier patrons meant better tips. Remember, Diane continued, tapping her clipboard, the Thompson party has a reservation at 7. Mr. Thompson is a major investor in the new downtown development. Make sure everything is flawless. James nodded. He understood the game. The Magnolia wasn't just about food, it was about status, about making people feel important, and James had become quite skilled at playing to egos, at making each guest feel like the most significant person in the room. As the doors opened and the evening service began, James moved through the restaurant with practiced grace. He guided a young couple celebrating their anniversary to table 9, recommended the chef's special to regulars at table 12, and ensured the wine was perfectly chilled for the business meeting at table 7. Everything was running smoothly until he noticed her. The elderly woman stood just inside the entrance, her posture dignified despite the slight stoop of her shoulders. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress, a string of pearls adorning her neck. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark skin carried the delicate creases of someone who had lived a life full of both joy and hardship. She wasn't on James's reservation list. She didn't look like the usual Magnolia clientele, and she was alone. Diane approached her, reservation book in hand. From his position across the room, James couldn't hear their exchange, but he saw the woman gesture toward an empty table, table 15, in his section. James felt a twinge of annoyance. Table 15 was a 4-top, perfect for the groups that tended to order multiple courses and bottles of wine. It would be wasted on a single elderly woman who would probably order the cheapest item on the menu and nurse a glass of water all evening. Diane was leading the woman toward his section now. James quickly finished taking an order and moved to intercept them. "Diane," he said quietly, "is there a reservation for table 15 that I missed?" "No," Diane replied, "but we're not fully booked, and Mrs. Lewis," the elderly woman supplied, her voice warm and clear. "Eleanor Lewis." "Mrs. Lewis would like a table by the window," Diane finished. James hesitated. "I was saving table 15 for larger parties. Perhaps table 3 would be more suitable." Table 3 was in the back, away from the windows, typically reserved for walk-ins or less desirable patrons. The woman, Mrs. Lewis, smiled, but James detected a hint of knowing in her eyes. "I've heard the garden view is quite lovely this time of year," she said, "and I don't get out to nice establishments very often these days." Before James could respond, Diane gave him a pointed look. "Table 15 will be fine, James." With no choice but to comply, James led Mrs. Lewis to the table by the window. He pulled out her chair with less flourish than he typically offered his guests, and placed a menu before her without his usual recommendations. "Your server will be with you shortly," he said, ready to move on to guests more worthy of his attention. "Aren't you my server?" young man, Mrs. Lewis asked, her head tilted slightly. James forced a smile. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy with several larger parties tonight, but Marcus is excellent. He'll take good care of you." Mrs. Lewis nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see." As James walked away, he caught Diane's disapproving glance from across the room. He shrugged it off. The restaurant business was about maximizing profit, after all. Marcus was newer, still learning the ropes. He could handle a simple one-top, while James focused on the guests who would make his evening worthwhile. Throughout the next hour, James found his attention repeatedly drawn to table 15. Mrs. Lewis sat with perfect posture, gazing out at the garden as the setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. She had ordered only a cup of soup and a small salad, confirming James's assumption. Once he caught her eye, and she offered a gentle smile that, for reasons he couldn't articulate, made him feel slightly ashamed. Then, at precisely 7 o'clock, the front doors opened again. The man who entered commanded attention without trying. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to respect. His dark skin gleamed under the chandeliers, and his closely cropped hair was beginning to silver at the temples. This had to be Mr. Thompson, the investor Diane had mentioned. James straightened his tie and prepared to approach, but the man moved directly toward table 15. James watched in confusion as the man bent to kiss Mrs. Lewis on the cheek before taking the seat across from her. "Sorry I'm late, Mum," the man said, his deep voice carrying across the now hushed restaurant. The meeting ran longer than expected. "Mum?" James felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach. Diane approached the table quickly, her professional smile firmly in place. "Mr. Thompson, it's an honor to have you dining with us tonight." So this was indeed the important investor, and Mrs. Lewis was his mother. James swallowed hard. "Thank you," Mr. Thompson replied. "I've been looking forward to trying your chef's famous roast duck. My mother was just telling me about the excellent service she's received so far." James couldn't hear Mrs. Lewis's response, but he saw her pat her son's hand with gentle affection. Diane turned toward the staff area, catching James's eye and beckoning him over with a sharp gesture. "That's Robert Thompson," she hissed when he reached her side. "And you pawned his mother off on Marcus." "I didn't know," James began, but Diane cut him off. "Fix it. Now. And James, if we lose his business because of this, you can forget about that recommendation to Chef Laurent I promised you." The reference to the famed New York chef sent a jolt of panic through James. That recommendation was his ticket to the internship he'd been working toward for years. He approached table 15 with his most charming smile in place. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Lewis, I'm James Whittaker, the head waiter. I'll be personally attending to you this evening." Robert Thompson looked up, his expression neutral. "I believe my mother was already being served by Marcus, was it?" "Yes, but for special guests, I like to provide personalized service," James explained smoothly. "Special guest," Robert repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what makes us special, Mr. Whittaker? Is it perhaps that you've recognized me?" James faltered under the man's direct gaze. "Well, we value all our guests, of course." "Of course," Robert agreed, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "But my mother mentioned that you were too busy with more important tables when she arrived. I'm curious what's changed." Mrs. Lewis placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Robert, please. There's no need for this." "There's every need, Mum," Robert said, his voice softening as he addressed his mother. "You deserve better than to be treated as an afterthought." James felt heat rising to his face. "Sir, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. If Mrs. Lewis felt in any way neglected—" "She wasn't neglected," Robert interrupted. "She was deliberately given less attention because of assumptions you made based on her appearance. I know how this works, Mr. Whittaker. I've been on both sides of it." Mrs. Lewis sighed. "Perhaps we should dine elsewhere tonight, Robert." "No," Robert said firmly. "You wanted to see the garden from this window. You're going to see it." He looked back at James. "We'll keep Marcus as our server. He's been perfectly attentive." Dismissed, James retreated, his cheeks burning with shame. From across the restaurant, he could feel Diane's disapproving gaze. His perfect evening had crumbled, and with it, possibly his future plans as well. As the evening progressed, James kept a watchful eye on table 15. He overheard snippets of conversation, Robert discussing his latest business venture, Mrs. Lewis sharing stories about her neighborhood garden club. They were joined by another man, introduced as Robert's husband, David, and the three of them engaged in easy conversation punctuated by genuine laughter. Despite his embarrassment, James found himself drawn to their dynamic. There was something about Mrs. Lewis that commanded attention not through wealth or status, but through a quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her. During a lull in service, James overheard a conversation between one of the busboys and Marcus. "Do you know who that is?" the busboy whispered, nodding toward Mrs. Lewis. Marcus shook his head. "That's Eleanor Lewis, the Eleanor Lewis. She was one of the first black teachers at Oak Ridge High back in the 60s. My grandmother was in her class. Says Mrs. Lewis changed her life, inspired her to go to college when nobody thought she could." James felt the weight of his misjudgment grow heavier. As the main course was being served, James noticed a commotion at the front of the restaurant. A group of well-dressed middle-aged men entered, led by Mayor Williams himself. The mayor spotted Robert and made a beeline for table 15. Robert Thompson, the mayor, called out, hand extended. "The man of the hour. I didn't know you'd be dining here tonight." Robert stood to shake the mayor's hand. "Just having dinner with my mother and David." The mayor turned to Mrs. Lewis with a respectful nod. "Mrs. Lewis, it's an honor. The school board still talks about your contributions to education in this town." Mrs. Lewis smiled graciously. "That's very kind of you to say, Mayor Williams, though I suspect they've exaggerated my importance over the years." "Not at all," the mayor insisted. "In fact, we're finalizing the name for the new library wing at the high school, and your name is at the top of the list." James, who had moved closer under the pretense of checking on a nearby table, felt his stomach sink further. The woman he had dismissed so easily was not only the mother of an important investor, but a local legend in her own right. The mayor continued, addressing Robert now. "We're still on for the presentation tomorrow, yes? The town is excited about the community center project." "Absolutely," Robert confirmed. "Though I should mention, I'm making a few changes to the funding allocation. I'd like to increase the educational resources section. My mother has convinced me of its importance." Mrs. Lewis looked surprised. "Robert, we only discussed that briefly." "Sometimes brief discussions with the right people make the biggest impact," Mum Robert said, smiling at her with evident affection. As the mayor and his entourage moved to their own table, James noticed several other diners looking toward table 15 with expressions of recognition and respect. How had he missed who this woman was? During dessert, James could stand it no longer. He approached table 15 again, this time with genuine humility. "Mrs. Lewis," he began, "I wanted to personally apologize for my earlier behavior. It was unacceptable, and you deserved better." Mrs. Lewis studied him for a moment, her eyes kind but penetrating. "Why do you think you treated me that way, young man?" The directness of her question caught James off guard. I made assumptions. I thought," he trailed off, unable to complete the sentence without revealing his own prejudice. "You thought I wasn't worth your time," Mrs. Lewis finished for him. "Because I was old, because I was alone, because I was black, or perhaps all three." David, Robert's husband, shifted uncomfortably, but Robert placed a hand on his arm, silently asking him to let his mother speak. James couldn't deny it. "Yes, and I was wrong. I'm truly sorry." Mrs. Lewis nodded. 45 years I spent teaching young people, Mr. Whitaker. Do you know what I learned?" James shook his head. "I learned that everyone has value. Everyone has a story. And the moment we decide someone isn't worth our time or attention is the moment we stop growing as human beings." Her words struck James with unexpected force. He thought about his own journey, how he'd been so focused on climbing toward his goal that he'd started to view people as mere stepping stones or obstacles. "Thank you for the apology," Mrs. Lewis continued. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. I accept it." James nodded, grateful yet still ashamed. "Is there anything else I can get for you this evening?" "Actually," Robert interjected, "we were discussing your culinary school ambitions. Marcus mentioned you're saving up to study in New York." But James blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. That's the plan." Robert exchanged a glance with his mother, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Perhaps we could discuss that further before we leave. My foundation offers several scholarships for promising culinary students." Hope and confusion warred within James. "That's incredibly generous, sir. But after how I treated Mrs. Lewis, I don't understand why you'd want to help me." Mrs. Lewis smiled. "Sometimes, Mr. Whitaker, the people who need second chances the most are those who don't believe they deserve them." Climax the following afternoon, James found himself standing in the back of a crowded community hall. He hadn't planned to attend the presentation for the new community center, but Mrs. Lewis's words had stayed with him through a sleepless night. Mayor Williams stood at the podium, introducing Robert Thompson to enthusiastic applause. Robert approached the microphone with confident grace. "Thank you, Mayor Williams, and thank you all for coming today. This community center project represents more than just a building. It represents opportunity, growth, and the belief that everyone in Oak Ridge deserves access to resources that enrich their lives." James listened, captivated, as Robert outlined his vision: a modern facility with sports amenities, meeting spaces, and an extensive educational wing. "And I'm particularly proud to announce that the Educational Center will be named after someone who has dedicated her life to the belief that education can transform lives and communities," Robert continued. "Someone who, despite facing discrimination and obstacles, never lost her commitment to seeing the potential in every person she met." He gestured toward the front row, and James craned his neck to see Mrs. Lewis rising to join her son on the stage, her face alight with surprise and emotion. The Eleanor Lewis Educational Center will include a state-of-the-art library, tutoring spaces, and a culinary arts program designed to give young people marketable skills and creative outlets. A culinary arts program. James felt his throat tighten. "And speaking of culinary arts," Robert continued, "I'd like to announce the establishment of the Eleanor Lewis Culinary Scholarship, which will annually send one promising student to study at the Laurent Institute in New York City." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the audience. "My mother has always believed in second chances," Robert said, his voice growing more personal. "She's always seen potential in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves, even when they didn't treat her with the dignity she deserved." His eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment James was certain Robert had spotted him at the back of the room, but the businessman continued without singling him out. "In honor of that spirit, the first scholarship will be awarded to a young man who, despite a rocky start, showed the courage to acknowledge his mistakes and the desire to grow beyond them. James Whitaker, are you here today?" A spotlight swung around, finding James frozen in shock at the back of the hall. All heads turned toward him. "Come on up," James Robert encouraged. On legs that felt disconnected from his body, James made his way to the stage. Mrs. Lewis stood beside her son, that same gentle smile on her face that had made James feel both seen and ashamed the night before. Robert handed James an envelope. "Congratulations on being the first recipient of the Eleanor Lewis Culinary Scholarship. Make her proud." James accepted the envelope with trembling hands. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll learn from yesterday," Mrs. Lewis suggested quietly. "Say you'll remember that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." "I will," James promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I absolutely will." As applause filled the hall, James turned to face the audience, seeing for the first time the diverse faces of his community, young and old, black and white and brown, wealthy and working class. People he had categorized and dismissed based on what he thought they could offer him. In that moment, James understood that the most valuable lesson he'd received hadn't come from culinary training or from learning to navigate the world of fine dining. It had come from an elderly woman who had every right to be bitter about how he'd treated her, but who had chosen to respond with grace and wisdom instead. 6 months later, James stood in the gleaming kitchen of the Laurent Institute, whisking a hollandaise sauce to perfection. His first semester had been challenging but exhilarating, pushing him beyond what he thought he was capable of achieving. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Mrs. Lewis, responding to the monthly updates he'd been sending her and Robert about his progress. "Dear James," it read, "your croquembouche looks marvelous. I'm proud of how far you've come. Not just in your culinary skills, but in your perspective. Robert and David send their best and want to know if you're still planning to return to Oak Ridge for your internship this summer. The culinary program at the community center is taking shape, and they believe you'd be an excellent mentor for the high school students." James smiled, remembering his initial reluctance when Robert had first suggested he give back by teaching at the community center. Now, the idea filled him with purpose. He typed a quick reply: "Dear Mrs. Lewis, I would be honored to help with the program. What I've learned most these past months is that the greatest achievements mean little if we don't use them to lift others up. You taught me that." As he returned to his sauce, James reflected on how a single evening, a single misjudgment, and its aftermath had altered the course of his life. He had gone to the Magnolia focused solely on what he could gain, on who could help him advance. He had measured people's worth by their appearance, their status, their potential usefulness to him. Mrs. Lewis had shown him a different way to move through the world. She had shown him that true dignity comes not from how others treat you, but from how you treat others, especially when they don't deserve it. The sauce had reached the perfect consistency. James removed it from the heat, just as Chef Laurent approached for inspection. "Beautiful," Mr. Whitaker, the renowned chef, commented. "You have a natural instinct for balance." "Thank you," Chef James replied. "I had an excellent teacher." He wasn't referring to his culinary instructors. That evening, James added a final paragraph to his email to Mrs. Lewis. "You asked me once why I treated you the way I did when you first came to the Magnolia. I've thought about that question every day since. The truth is, I had become so focused on where I wanted to go that I stopped seeing the humanity in the people around me. You could have responded with anger, and it would have been justified. Instead, you offered understanding and opportunity. You saw more in me than I saw in myself at that moment. I promise I will work every day to extend that same grace to others, to see their potential. Not just their present, to treat everyone with the dignity they deserve, regardless of who I think they are or what I think they can offer me. That, I believe, is your true legacy." He hit send, then turned to the window of his small New York apartment. The city lights twinkled below, each one representing a person with their own story, their own struggles, their own dignity. James had nearly missed the most important lesson of his life because he had failed to see the worth in a single elderly woman who didn't fit his definition of importance. Never again, he promised himself. Never again. And that, my friends, is the story of how a waiter's prejudice led to an unexpected lesson in dignity and grace. Eleanor Lewis could have responded to disrespect with anger. Instead, she chose to transform it into an opportunity for growth, not just for James, but for an entire community. We all make split-second judgments about people based on appearances, age, race, or other external factors. The question isn't whether we have these thoughts, the question is what we do with them. Do we allow them to control our actions, or do we challenge them? Recognizing the inherent worth in every person we encounter. Eleanor Lewis spent her life teaching young people to see beyond the surface, to recognize potential where others saw limitations. Her son, Robert, learned that lesson well, using his success to create opportunities for others. And James learned that the path to true fulfillment isn't paved with self-interest, but with respect for the dignity of all. What about you? When was the last time you misjudged someone based on appearances? When was the last time you were misjudged? How did you respond?